Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fifth session in American English Live Series 21. I'm so excited that each of you are here with us today. I'm Dr. Darlene Wiggins Dockery, and I will be with you today, along with my colleague behind the scenes, Elena, who will be responding to your comments in the chat and answering your questions. We wanted to let you know that today's session will be recorded and shared across various platforms. By attending and adding comments to the chat or the comments box, you are your name, your country, and or your comment may be included in the video recording. By participating, you are consenting to your appearance in the recording and its use for the purposes related to the work of FHI 360 and the U.S. Department of State. If you do not want to appear in the recording, please do not put any responses in the comments box or the chat box during the live webinar. Throughout Series 21, we are exploring a variety of strategies for building academic skills for success and assessment in the English language classroom. We hope that you're able to use the practical ideas that we share. So here's what you can expect today. The session is about 60 minutes long. The presenter will present the material, and I, as your host, will ask questions and make comments too. But we really want to hear from you, our audience, so that we can address your ideas and your experiences. So please share your thoughts using the comments box or the chat feature. When our session comes to a close, you will have the opportunity to receive a digital badge for your participation. At the end of the webinar, we'll share a link in the comments. Click on that link and complete a short quiz about today's session. You must answer 2 out of 3 of the multiple choice questions correctly on your first attempt in order to receive the badge. If you successfully pass the quiz on your first attempt, you can expect to get your badge via email in about a week. And before we get started, we wanted to let you know that the newest issue of English Teaching Forum is now available. Check out volume 62, issue number 3, to find strategies for facilitating successful cross-cultural collaboration, giving effective instructions in the classroom, implementing an integrated skills activity using pictures, and much, much more. Visit the link being shared by the moderator to read the latest issue. Now for today's webinar, creating peer assessment rubrics to encourage students' English language production. Peer assessment rubrics are a great tool to help students interpret and apply evaluation criteria to their work and those of their classmates. The session will demonstrate how to align peer assessment rubrics to classroom objectives to build student success. The presenter will also share practical strategies for how students can use rubrics for peer assessment in writing and oral presentation preparation, as well as examples of how rubrics can be used to support lower proficiency students. and we are pleased to introduce our speaker, Mary Louise Baez. Originally from Sacramento, California, Mary Louise is currently a regional English language officer based in Washington, D.C. Previously, she taught, supervised, trained, and administered TESOL programs at the binational centers in Costa Rica and Paraguay, and spent 2 decades at Cambridge University Press as a consultant and trainer in Central America and the United States. Most recently, she was a technical assistance consultant with American Institutes for Research, where she supported K-12 and adult educational programs and served on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council. She also served as Paraguay TESOL president in 1995 to 1996. She's delighted to combine her BA in International Relations from Pomona College with her MA in Linguistics from CSU Fresno. Welcome, Mary Louise.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Darlene, and getting everyone ready for today. So it's afternoon here in Washington, D.C., but it may be morning or evening where you are joining us from. So thank you for taking time out of your busy teaching day to join us. I'd like us to think about our role as a student. Have you used peer assessments as a student? When I was in elementary school, Darlene, I used to create peer assessments with my best friend. When we knew that we'd have a test coming up, we would prepare our assessments for each other. How about you?
Well, I didn't have a best friend that I prepared assessments with, but I did go through a period where I thought my teacher didn't give me enough homework, so I would make up homework for myself. And that would be based on the way I thought she would do it.
Oh my goodness, that is exciting. So let's go ahead and move to another perspective. So that was our perspective as students. Now let's put on our teacher hat.
Okay.
And if you used peer assessment with your students, how did your students engage in the assessment? Did they complete the task, didn't engage, or went off task? Seemed confused? Or answer D, you haven't used peer assessment. Go ahead and share your answers in the chat.
Okay, so we want to hear from you. Have you used peer assessments in your classroom with your students? And if you did, how did your students engage with the assessment? Did they A, complete the task? B, they didn't engage and went off task? C, they seemed confused? Or D, you haven't used peer assessment yet? So let us know. Let's see what your responses are, if any have come in yet. And yes, we are hearing from you. Lone said A, completed the task. Muhammad said C, seemed confused. Nan said, no, I haven't used it. Lovely said, seemed confused. Let's see. And we have one more response from Catherine. And Catherine said, A, completed the task. So we got varied responses there, Mary Louise.
Well, you know, Darlene, if you had asked me this, depending on when you asked me during my career, if it was my first year of teaching, I would have answered D. Then the first times I implemented it, I would have answered either C or B. Later, after reflection and practice and feedback from peers and mentors, I would have been able to answer A. So it would just depend on when what year in my teaching career I used peer assessment.
I get that. I was thinking as you were saying that, for me, it would depend on the life stage of my students because I've taught students from elementary school to higher ed and graduate students. And so how I use them would change too. My responses would have changed too. Back to you, Mary Louise.
That makes perfect sense, Darlene. So in today's session, we have 3 objectives. We're going to discuss the benefits and challenges of peer assessment. Then we're going to explore aligning peer assessment rubrics with classroom objectives. And finally, how rubrics can support lower proficiency students. So let's go ahead and get started. And in our various educational settings, we may use the terms assessments and rubrics in different ways. So I'd like to set the stage for today's session by sharing how we will use the terms today. In today's session, we'll use peer assessment when we refer to how students use a rubric, similar to what the teacher will use to grade their work, to assess a classmate's either written or oral work. And rubrics will refer to the framework that outlines the criteria that will be assessed. And finally, in our English classroom, rubric-based peer assessments are a short list of criteria, short being the important word here, that students use to assess each other's work in a collaborative setting. And collaborative is another important word that we'll be referring to later on as well. So now it's your turn. When you look at these pictures, which picture best describes your feelings when you have to grade student work? And why? Go ahead and share your ideas in the chat.
Oh my goodness.
To you, Darlene.
Those are some very different expressions. I think, though, unfortunately, immediately I thought of those feelings like teacher number one. And usually I would have those feelings if I had to grade essays for a class where there was a great deal of variation in the student skill levels. That was figuring out how to support them and scaffold across so many different developmental stages left me feeling a lot like teacher one. Let's see what our participants say.
Okay.
We are hearing, we're getting a variety of responses, Mary Louise. We have a couple who said no, teacher two. With Jorge gave the comment, in addition, teacher two is the ideal choice, but it depends on the kind of group we have. And then Larissa said both ways. And yes, I think most of us can say at sometimes we felt like both of the teachers. And then Ambrin said teacher two, Lone said teacher one, and Alex said, I'm assuming this is one because his comment was, of course, excited and highly interested. So those are some of the responses. Back to you, Mary Louise.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I think, who we're teaching is important, and that may impact how we feel, and also the type of assignment as well. The longer the essays were, I felt more like teacher one.
Exactly.
And that's why I think peer assessment is so important and can be helpful to us. Here, Murphy is summarizing the reasons I have integrated peer assessment into my teaching over the years. Some students are more analytical than others. Some, like me, like to know what and how they are supposed to complete an assignment. Others want to be engaged in their own learning and see their progress. And finally, peer assessments give us that opportunity to receive initial feedback as students before we submit our final product. And that helps us remove a layer of stress for the teacher. from that perspective. And I was sharing with you about creating these peer assessments with my best friend. We also would exchange our written work with each other and write comments to each other similar to the comments the teacher might write. Like, oh, I don't understand this, or can you tell me more?
You were just destined to be a teacher, Mary Louise.
And I kept saying that was what one of the careers I wasn't sure about. I don't know. And it was my first job, and I haven't looked back. So let's go ahead and continue. And thinking about this and what motivates us as learners, based on your responses, they tie into what I'm sharing in this quote. In Motivating Learners, Motivating Teachers, Dornier and Kubanyawa tell us that it's important to create agency for our students. And what is agency? It's a proactive investment in the learning process. It's their ability to act in that specific situation with confidence. And they enjoy a more fuller and meaningful learning experience. You know, Darlene, you were saying that in your learning, you didn't feel that you always had enough work. Well, this would be a way to engage you more if you were using peer assessment to really think about the work that you were doing too.
Mm-hmm.
And then your motivation for creating that extra work for yourself too was intrinsic motivation. It came from within. And you wanted that task to be enjoyable too. So we want to give our students opportunities to make language learning material their own. That way they can take ownership of it and be engaged and be invested in that process as well. So now your turn. What are some benefits of using rubric-based peer assessments in an English language classroom?
Okay. So we're looking to hear from you. What are some benefits that you have found in using rubric-based peer assessments for those of you who have in an English language classroom? See,
What are ones that you think you might have, right?
Yes, that's another way to think about it as well. If you haven't, what do you think the benefits might be? We've heard from someone already. We are hearing from Tijini. Oh, please pardon me for butchering your name. I'm going to try Tijegni, and it gives freedom for students to understand a lot. And then we heard from Catherine, who said structure and clear expectations. Orlando said it helps students to know what is expected. Sudnishna said the learners get the chance for decision making. Miriam said it keeps students engaged and builds a sense of responsibility. Nagala said the class will be student-centered. Then we heard from Diego, who said when some students help each other in the review process, they can understand something they didn't understand at first. Moses says using rubrics helps students to be more organized and realize how they can help themselves and also help their classmates. And let's see, I think that's our last comment for a while. Back to you, Mary Louise.
Thank you. I think all of these comments really will be demonstrated here in my next slide. So let's take a look at the benefits. You were talking about it's building the framework for future self-assessment. One of the participants stated that it was good to build up that confidence for them. And someone else talked about collaboration as well, and that the work would be improved because it would be a better first draft if it had peer review prior to getting it to the teacher. And that student confidence as well. All of those were addressed, plus some others as well. And then all of these benefits address these challenges. I think sometimes it's a mindset. When I taught ESL methods courses previously, I would tell my students that if collaborative learning had not been part of the students' learning experience, they would need to help guide students to the benefits of collaborative learning through modeling and providing different types of tasks like jigsaw or other tasks that can only be completed if they work together. And then they could see the benefit of collaborative learning. And we had another term here about the affective filter too, of how we feel. What are our emotions when we're put into a new situation? For some students, writing in English can be extremely stressful. I think for those of you who English was your first language, you can think of writing in a different language. I know for me, writing in Spanish is not so easy. And for those of you who English is a second language, you can think of that first time you had to write, either when you had a blank piece of paper in front of you or a blank screen. And it can be stressful. So now we've discussed our benefits and challenges. Let's go ahead and move to our next objective, exploring the alignment of peer assessment rubrics with classroom objectives. So how are we going to develop this peer assessment rubric? Whenever we travel to a new place, we need a map. And someone talked about that students want to know where they're going. We make use of maps or a mapping app now on our phones. And the teacher needs the roadmap as well to plan out how to incorporate a new or updated strategy into our teaching. And it's a good way to create a learning outcome plan. Next, I'll share how we can develop a writing peer assessment rubric. So these are the questions I'm going to ask myself to see how these can align, because that's what we talked about. We want to make sure that our objectives align with our outcomes and our final product. So what are our objectives? I'm going to ask myself the question, which classroom objectives will I cover? I want to make sure in my task that students can write clear and well-organized paragraphs, describe.
Oh, it looks like we have technical difficulties.
Describing an experience. What will I receive from them?
Okay, Mary Louise, you left us for a moment. Do you mind reading that again, please?
Sure. Okay. Can you hear me again?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. So we need to find out what will our students turn into us? What work will we receive from them? So the final product will be a 2 to 5 paragraph, well-organized autobiography. Notice the level. This will be for an intermediate level of students of language proficiency. And the learning outcome. My learning outcome for them is I want to make sure that they can use the past tense and transition words to create this well-organized, focused paragraph. And the areas of assessment. I want to look at the content of their writing, their organization, and finally, their grammar and mechanics. And notice that I list grammar and mechanics at the end, because if we don't have the content and we don't have the organization, the sentences can be perfect sentences grammatically, but if they don't connect, it won't be able to be understood by the reader. So now it's your turn. Why is it important to create a student learning outcome plan first? Go ahead and share your ideas in the chat.
Okay. Why is it important to create a student learning outcome plan first when we want to guide our students with their writing? I was just thinking about myself as a student, Mary Louise, and it was really important for me to know why. Why am I doing this? How is this going to help me in life? And that was if I couldn't get a good enough answer from the teacher on that, then the assignment was going to be so much harder for me to complete because I had to have the why. Um, let's see what some of our students have said. Mr. Muhammad said, is if anything is without objectives, I can consider it nothing. Same thing. Why is it important? Tina said to make follow-ups. Then we heard from Diego, who said they need a specific route to follow their progress. Moises said it's like a guide. If you don't have a plan and improvise, the outcome can be negative. Ambream said to assess the learner's needs. So it serves as a needs analysis. And then we have a couple of more responses that are coming in. Larissa says it gives a clear picture of what we can evaluate. And then we had another participant who said to reach the goal of the lesson. So those are all some very good responses. Thank you all for your participation.
Absolutely wonderful. So let's look at the assignment that I used with my students. Please note that this is not a first week task. I used the autobiography assignment with my students because I wanted them to be able to write about what they knew. And I had them interview one or more people to tell them about that period in their life. And the reason I had them do the interview was because I wanted this autobiography assignment to be an introduction into research, but they were researching about their own lives. And they were writing 2 or 5 paragraphs about that time in their life, and they were using past tense to tell the story of that event and how it made them feel. And we had been using time phrases, first, second, next, finally, and also transition phrases. That's what we had been working on in terms of our structure of our writing. But I told students, because I was using this with middle school students as a mid-semester task, and I used it with adult students in my university class as a final semester project. But I told both groups of students when I used it that they would be sharing their writing with their classmates. So I wanted them to make sure they were comfortable sharing these events in their lives. Additionally, I thought about it. I learned from one of my students a very sad situation of her life when she had lost both of her parents in a car accident. So I want us to think about also some alternatives because we know our students. We know what they've experienced. We know if we're working with students that have experienced trauma in their lives or are struggling emotionally. So maybe writing about their own life might be difficult, but maybe they can write about a hero's biography. So we want to be able to adapt the task as well. So let's look at how we're going to create this peer assessment rubric for the autobiography. For content, and we want to give guiding questions to our students, we don't just want to say, you're going to read for content, because they don't know what exactly they're reading for. So we give them some guiding questions, and then they'll have an opportunity to comment if they are reading for this particular area. Next, we talked about organization. We want them to go back in and then read and underline the sequencing of words. Were they in the correct order? Also, were all the events in the correct order as well? What about the transition words that were used between paragraphs? How did they connect the two ideas? Finally, in the rubric, we have the section on grammar. Are all the sentences in the past tense? Are all the verbs spelled correctly? And we're going to look at how we're going to implement this rubric, but I create groups of 3 trios, and in the trio, each person becomes a subject matter expert on one of these areas. So for example, Darlene would be reading about content. She would read all the essays in our trio about content. I would read about organization. I would become the expert on organization. And the 3 essays that are in my group, I will only be reading for that particular aspect of the rubric. And our third colleague would only be reading about grammar. One of us may be a faster reader than the others. So we have that opportunity to be able to have some additional comments as well. So if you finish your section of the rubric, you can also go in and write some additional comments for the writer. So there are 3 areas to focus that the teacher will review when grading the final content. We want to be able to prepare our students for their peer assessment. And it's almost like coaching when you're coaching a team or being a teacher. For example, for dance, I did dance when I was in high school. So I think of those coaches or those teachers that are building a skill. We want to build the peer assessment skill. And in Key Issues for Language Teaching, Jack Richards points out, why do we need to prepare our students? As you indicated earlier in the polls, not all students have been exposed to this particular strategy. For students who are hesitant to try peer assessment because they've never been exposed to it before, they may not see the value in it. So an approach I have found useful has been to model the process as a whole class. I'll use a writing sample from another class without any identifying information. I won't use the student's name in it. And I'll be using the rubric to align the learning goals and objectives, as we've pointed out. And I'll model the process with my students so they learn what I'm thinking in my head. So let's see how this would work out, how it would play out in our classroom. First, I'd ask the students what they'd been learning and what their writing task is, because this will allow me to be able to share the self-assessment rubric with them. If we have assigned writing previously and used a rubric to provide feedback, then they're familiar with this concept of a rubric, even though they haven't used it for peer assessment yet. Then, once we've reviewed what is involved in the rubric, we can model it using a think aloud. And a think aloud is where we talk about our processes. What are we saying in our head as we're going through the process? I'm saying, oh, I like this information. Oh, I don't think I understand what the writer was trying to say. Oh, I don't think this past tense is spelled correctly, so I'll just circle it. So all of those thoughts that are going through my head, that's what I'm sharing with the students via the think aloud. Finally, then I'll create the groups. I told you I'd be working with trios, 3 students. Each student is responsible for one of the 3 main areas of the rubric. Next, each student reads the writing for the piece that they received, and then they pass it to the next person. So the writing piece, the essay, and the rubric always travel together as they're being reviewed in their circle. At the end, all 3 students will have read each of those 3 essays, and each of the 3 participants in the group had that area that they were subject matter experts on. One person being the content expert, the next person being the organization expert, and the final person being the grammar and mechanics expert. Finally, the original writer of that essay receives their essay back along with their rubric. And they can use that peer feedback to improve their first draft before they hand it in to the teacher. So how do we manage this in our classroom? Let's look at the process. First, all students receive a first draft and a copy of the rubric. Now, the first draft is not their first draft. I cannot receive my essay. Darlene cannot receive her essay. We have to receive essays from another trio of students. Our content feedback expert, and then next our organization feedback expert, and finally our grammar feedback expert all have 3 different essays and 3 rubrics. Student A reads for their content feedback, student B for organization, and student C for grammar. That is round number 1. Next, round number 2, they will pass those to the next person, and they will read those for their particular area of content, either content, organization, or grammar. They will provide that feedback. Then the essay and the rubric travel to the third person, and they will do the final read before the first draft and the rubric are returned to the writer. Let's see what this would look like. So Darlene and I are going to pretend that we are 3 people in a trio, but there's only 2 of us, so bear with us, okay? So each of us, when we receive our essay, we're going to read it first. So we have a shortened version here. It's not a long essay because our slide couldn't contain all of that information. So Darlene, do you want to read it?
I'll read it. Okay. Okay. When I was 10 years old, my family moved to a new town. I was sad because I lost my old friends. First, my parents took me to a new school. Then, some of the students laughed at my accent. I'm missing my old town. Eventually, I made new friends. However, I continue to call my old friends. Over the holiday, I went back to visit them.
So I'm the content expert, and this is the peer comment that I would write. I want to know more about what else happened at the new school. Because I don't have too much information, I know that they laughed and that the person was missing their old school. Okay, Darlene, then you will be reading for organization.
Okay. So then I would be looking for transition words. And in this case, first, eventually, and however are the transition words that stand out because they've been underlined.
And we can have positive comments like Darlene has provided here. Good job using the sequence words. They're in order and they help tell the story, make it clear to the reader.
Mm-hmm.
Then I'm going to put on a hat and I'm going to be a third student in my class. And I'm going to look at the sentences in the past tense. And are all the verbs spelled correctly? I don't have to correct the verbs. I just need to circle them. And then this is my comment. Some of the sentences are not in the past tense. And then the student would be able to have that information and revise their draft before they moved on to give it to the teacher. Now it's your turn. How can you adapt this activity to meet the unique needs of your language learners?
Okay, so I know we have some participants who teach very large classes. So, wondering how can you adapt this activity to meet the unique needs of your language learners? We have different age levels, different sizes of classes, different availability of technology in our audience, Mary Louise. So, let's see what some of the responses are from our participants. But while we're waiting for responses to come in, we have a couple of comments. Fariha said, "This is a very informative session." And then we heard from Tajegne, who said, "I think these steps can be good for teachers while they're preparing students for writing peer assessments." And then in response to our reflection question, Pablo said, "I think it's a good tool so students can be more active and have more participation in the class." We also heard from Jorge, who said, "The same process can be adapted to a speaking activity following the same rubrics." Oh, is he reading your mind, Mary Louise? And then we have
And so
Diego.
I think
And then we have Diego, who said, "I would try to focus on the students that have more trouble in understanding." Wafa said, "These steps can be used across various subjects." Moises said, "It can be adapted to vocabulary, grammar building skills, and different subjects as well." So thank you for your responses, everyone. Back to you, Mary Louise.
thanks, Darlene, and thank you everyone for sharing those great ideas. And someone was definitely reading our mind of where we're going next. Developing an oral assessment rubric, and we're going to use the same steps here. Let's take a look at how we will use the same steps. Our rationale. Why do we need this? Have you ever had your students do oral presentations and the rest of the students are either looking out the window or doodling or not engaged? Well, this keeps them engaged. It helps us also introduce the rubric format that I will use as a teacher to assess the presentation. It helps them build their listening skills. And it also lowers the affective filter for the presenter. And students as raters as well, because they start learning how to do this and realize what the teacher will be evaluating them on as well. So how do we create it? We're going to also use a student learning outcome plan, and we're going to use similar questions that we're going to ask ourselves as the teacher. First, which objectives will be covered? And this, you're going to notice, follows along. This is the oral presentation version of the autobiography. The final product, it's going to be short, a 5-minute oral presentation with visuals to support the timeline. And we're going to ask that students don't read it. The level is also an intermediate level, and the learning outcome. They're going to give the organized presentation using sequence and transition words. And this is the format for the rubric. Students are going to write 3 things they learned, 2 words they heard, and 1 past tense verb they heard. So let's look at what that rubric will look like. Using 3-2-1, and I'm sure some of you may have used 3-2-1 technique for various aspects of your language learning classrooms, in your language learning classrooms. So 2, they're going to write the sequence words and the transition words. So that's the organization focus. And finally, they're going to list grammar. 1 verb they heard in the past tense, Because notice, as they're listening, they're going to listen to a lot and they're going to have to take notes quickly. So we can't have them listening for too many objectives. And they can also check off on presentation style. Was the speaker using visuals? Did the speaker pause? Did the speaker look up at the class? Or was the speaker only looking down at their notes? Again, we want to prepare our students to be able to do this. You can find short videos, a video example of oral presentations, or you can give an oral presentation yourself. Then you will hand out the rubric to the students and review it with them. Then you'll show the video and the teacher will complete the rubric on the board or on their screen. But because you've got a video going, you can't do the think aloud at the same time. So you will do that part afterwards, where the teacher will share the thoughts that they had as they were writing their comments. Next, they will listen to that video again, and then they'll complete the practice rubric themselves. And finally, they'll share their answers, and the teacher can provide any comments back. And at this point, too, the teacher can also give some sentence frames of how to give that feedback, because we want to be respectful of each other. We want to teach our students how to be respectful of each other when they're giving feedback in the class. So how will this improve oral performance? By completing the peer assessment while they're listening, then a student will receive back many pieces of paper. They will receive back all of the rubrics from their classmates. And then how will the student process these? There's a few ways that they can process them. Let's take a look at those 3 ways. They can review the feedback independently with a table partner or with the teacher or in a small group. And the teacher, having seen all of these rubrics with the feedback, can also receive feedback for themselves. You can realize students were still having problems with a transition word. All of the feedback said they didn't hear any transition words. I better review those. So there's ways to get feedback for yourself, not just for the students. And then the student uses that feedback to improve their oral presentations. So we've been looking at how we're using materials for intermediate level students, but I know you don't all teach intermediate level students. So let's look at our 3rd objective. How can rubrics support lower proficiency students? What are some specific challenges low proficiency language learners might face with peer assessments? Go ahead and write your answers in the chat.
Okay, so what are some specific challenges low proficiency language learners might face with peer assessments? I'm
I
thinking.
know sometimes, go ahead, Dorothy.
I was just going to share some comments as the responses come in, but you go ahead.
Great. I wanted to share that I had thought that it might be difficult to do peer assessment with younger learners. And this past spring, I observed a class of kindergarten English immersion students using peer assessment.
Wow.
And I was blown away. My hat's off to the teacher. And then I realized, of course, with the training and the coaching that the teacher provides, the students are able to use these techniques at any level. But also the rubric, as we'll notice later on, can be more visual. It doesn't have to have as many words or as much text within the rubric.
Okay, well, let's see. We have some responses that I'll share with you. One is from Fariha, who said one of the challenges specific challenges for working with low proficiency language learners with peer assessments might be a lack of understanding. Diego said they could face backlash when seeing how advanced some of their peers are. Mohammed said less confident. Ambreen said expressions might be limited. And then Wafa said they might not even understand the rubrics themselves. So I think those are some of the things that you mentioned that you saw addressed in working with the very young students, how the teacher got around making the rubric comprehensible for the little ones that she was working with. So back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Darlene. So let's take a look of how we can do this. So here's some challenges, and I think most of these challenges were already named by all of you. Less vocabulary to express themselves, that lack of self-confidence in using English. And also sometimes an expectation, if they haven't been exposed to peer assessment previously, thinking that only the teacher can provide that feedback. Mm-hmm. So how can the peer assessment support those learners? Well, as I mentioned earlier, we want to, if we align with our objectives, it's focused. And it's also aligned with our outcomes. And we want to be able to use language or visuals that are level appropriate as well. So let's take a look at what one of these rubrics, how it could be adapted for student needs. Our peer comment can be simply a yes or no, and students can circle. So they don't even have to write out the words yes or no. Again, we want to make sure that they understand the question that we're asking. If it's for writing, we can have them underline the sequence and transition words. And we can ask them, are all of these in the past tense? Yes or no? They don't have to tell us how those would be changed. And then they can write one thing that they liked. We want to also provide direct instruction on the rubric vocabulary, like sequence word. Sequence word would be something that they would have been exposed to earlier in your class if that was your objective. Transition word as well. Lots of times we're using these terms in our classes and the student doesn't make the connection between the term and the actual words, and they may actually know how to use those words appropriately. And then also the types of comments and providing sentence frames like this one. I liked how, and then the student can finish it. Or I liked this. My favorite part was. And they could even be asked to underline their favorite part. They wouldn't even have to write it out again. So at this point, I would like to recap our helpful hints from today's session. I might not use peer assessment with every assignment because, as you can see, it does take time. And as Darlene pointed out, many of you may be in large multi-level classes. So you can't expect to use it for every assignment. But when you're planning your term out, think about which assignment it will be best for. Talk to your students about the benefits and share your fears about the first time that you used peer assessment as a student yourself. That helps lower their affective filter. And by showing the rubric and practicing modeling it with them, that will also help the implementation be smoother for you. So today, we have met 3 objectives that I had set forth for our session. I'd like us to take a moment and stop and reflect.
Okay.
Go ahead, Darlene.
I was going to say that I was going to read the reflection, but I would like for you all to continue the conversation in social media and in your groups after you reflect on this. After seeing some examples of peer assessment rubrics, how will you incorporate or adapt your use of peer assessments? In the interest of time, we can't put it in the comment box this time, but please let's keep the conversation going. Back to you, Mary Louise.
Thanks, Darlene. So I'd like to close with this thought. Peer assessment provides students with the opportunity to be engaged in their learning. It provides an insight into what the teacher does when they're assessing. And it helps students also reflect on what is important in their work. I think of this quote that I've come across, and it's been attributed to Confucius, Native Americans, Ben Franklin, John Dewey. Tell me and I will listen. Teach me and I'll remember. Involve me and I will learn. Collaborative tasks involve our students and support their long-term learning by modeling tasks that give our students multiple opportunities to practice, which increases their chance of being incorporated into a student's lifelong learning. I want to thank you for participating and sharing your experiences with me today. May we all continue to incorporate new strategies to involve our students, like peer assessment, to build their writing and speaking proficiency.
And thank you, Mary Louise, for sharing these great strategies for building peer assessment tools and rubrics to support our student success.